Let's see. All right. Uh, cool. Okay. It looks like it's mostly leveled out, so we can get going. So I will turn it over to our solar designer, Chris.
All right, thank you, Jill. Great to be with everyone today. Looking forward to discussing the renewable energy transition with you, which is obviously a fairly broad topic, but we'll do our best to sort of, focus in on some of the important points, talk about how revision can help you along the pathway to the renewable energy transition. And yeah, as Jill said, we'll get some questions answered at the end. So thanks again for joining. And I'll probably be talking for about 45 minutes here. Bear with me if you can. And again, we'll open it up for Q&A at the end. You'll see that our website's there, our office phone number, my email address as well. So you can certainly feel free to call me if you have questions. I'm happy to answer them sort of off the record if you like. And our website certainly has a ton of great resources for you to check out as well. So if you have a chance to jot that down, I'll give you a second. Post that at the end of the slideshow as well. So I'm going to talk first about revision. Just a little bit, might be interesting for all of you to learn a bit more about us. Jill and I think, have both been with Revision about 5 years, something I'm, just immensely proud of, to be continuing to work for this company. What's our mission? To lead our community in solving the environmental problems caused by fossil fuels while alleviating economic and social injustice. Obviously, that's quite ambitious, a lot of work to do. Fortunately enough, there's quite a lot of us attempting it. This picture was taken at our most recent sort of company-wide gathering. And gosh, that was probably about 2 years ago by now, or more. Obviously, that has not been possible of late to get everyone together. In the meanwhile, I think we're well up to over 300 employees at this point total, with more planning. We're planning to add more, of course, this coming year. So yeah, Revision is certainly continuing to grow. We do have branches two in Maine, one in obviously South Portland. That's our company headquarters. Another branch up in Liberty, Maine, two in New Hampshire, and one in Massachusetts. And yeah, an employee-owned company, which is also something we're all very proud of. That was a change that took place in 2017. We switched to a employee stock ownership plan. There's a lot of ESOPs out there. I encourage you to take some time to learn more about why an ESOP is something that's good for each and every employee. We're all very, very proud to be part of an employee-owned company. Revision's also a B corporation, a certified B corporation. Not many folks, I find, aren't familiar with what this designation means. It's sort of it's a voluntary designation, one that we have to pay to we pay to have a third party basically perform an audit each year in order to say that yes, Revision can say that it is a certified B corporation. It's a triple bottom line. Effectively, this is just a way for us to demonstrate to the community at large that we're not simply about profit. We're also trying to meet certain standards of community engagement, environmental stewardship, so on and so forth. And I think you'd find that there's a lot of B Corps out there that you weren't aware were B Corps. So look into that if you have a chance. Again, it's another designation that we're quite proud of. So again, that's Revision. And we'd love to talk more with you about renewable energy transition and the work we're doing in the community and all that good stuff. So please do check out our website if you have a chance to learn more about us and what we're doing. But anyway, now to focus in on, again, the renewable energy transition. Why is this important? Well, we're all aware of what's happening with the climate, greenhouse gas pollution. And this sort of pie chart here sort of helps you helps you visualize what is contributing to all of that pollution. The majority of greenhouse gas pollution, in fact, comes from energy use. And the majority of that is actually devoted to electricity production, heating, and transportation. All of those uses, all that energy use is what's driving the change in our climate today. And as we can see, unfortunately, the United States individuals, in fact, in the United States, are the biggest perpetrators. Now, obviously, that's not something that we have a whole lot of agency in ourselves. We can talk more about that, but as a collective, as you can see, relative to other parts of the world, it's a problem. In fact, you can see next to the house here on the left, there's two people. That's trying to illustrate the fact that this is just, on an individual per capita basis. That's what this graph is trying to illustrate, the extent to which, we're all responsible individually, whether we like it or not, for a huge amount of carbon pollution, far more than in other parts of the world. And how do we change this? How do we change this story? The Deep Decarbonization Pathways Report of 2015 found that we can achieve an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 by investing in technology that we already have available today, certainly solar. We're going to talk more about that. The ways to reduce this are energy efficiency, making buildings, for example, more energy efficient. That's something that perhaps many of you have already begun to do on your own. Electricity decarbonization, we need electricity, of course, but right now, so much of it comes from, for example, natural gas, especially in New England. So we need to figure out more ways of, removing carbon from the electricity production process. And obviously just switching of fuels in general, right? Electric vehicles, great example of that, right? And, there's ways, long story short, there's ways to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions without, of course, telling everybody, that they need to pursue a lifestyle, something like this. It does not need to be that dramatic. Not to say that, living in a little cabin by a lake like this with a lawn for a roof might not be appealing. Certainly to me, there's some appeal there, but, it's not practical in general, for many of us. And so, it's good to focus in on the practical ways that we can all lend a hand in order to help reduce greenhouse gas pollution, climate change. I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of the local implications. And, as you can see, this is a little snip from a recent CMP bill, right? We all know about CMP. They're not very well regarded here in Maine. And you'll see that quote up there on the left from a Portland Press Herald article. Central Maine Power ranked dead last in the nation for customer satisfaction. That's telling. And then, of course, we've all been hearing about the rate increases. We started hearing about them towards the end of last year. And many of you, I'm sure by now, have gotten a bill which will reflect the extent to which CMP's rates just went up at a very inconvenient time, I dare say, right? With, this being winter and electricity usage is always going to be higher in the winter in this part of the world. And there's a snip here from the delivery page of a CMP bill. And you can see that there's a $14.20 minimum charge. So that's up, that charge there goes up basically $1 at least once a year. It was $13 and some odd cents towards the end of 2021. Now up to $14. So you're going to pay that $14 no matter what happens. No matter how much electricity you use, you'll pay at least that much per month. What specifically changed on January 1st, 2022 was this electric delivery rate right there. That's what went up to, a little bit less than 10 cents per kilowatt hour. So when you add that with the supply rate, right now you get a total kilowatt hour rate of 21 cents. That's up 6 cents from December of last year, which is a 30 some odd % increase. And now again, that's a larger increase than what usually happens, but CMP, does raise their rates multiple times a year. So that's the status quo. A utility that is, again, very poorly reviewed by their ratepayers, subject to frequent increases. And again, as I said a little bit earlier, in New England, CMP included, our utilities are getting most of their electricity from natural gas. A little bit in Maine from hydro as well, but mostly from fossil fuel sources like natural gas. So that's the status quo. Let's talk about something more positive. Let's talk about the alternative, the solar powered household, where the renewable energy transition has taken place. Sort of the big umbrella here is that what we want to do is help homeowners and business owners alike switch as much of the energy used as possible away from fossil fuels towards electricity. Now, there's a few different ways we can do that. In this graphic, which is one we're really keen on, we illustrate that there's, you can pursue heat pumps for heating and cooling, electric hot water, maybe battery storage, maybe electric car charging. But again, we're electrifying as much as possible. That's going to differ per, by household. Not every household can do it the same way or to the same extent. But again, electrify the home as much as you can, and then provide your own clean electricity cleanly up there on the roof. That's the goal, something all of us can achieve. Let's talk more about solar itself. Over the years, as solar technologies improved, the cost per watt, the number of dollars needed to get watts of electricity through solar, that's gone down while adoption has increased. And, just in the time that I've been revision, price per watt for solar panels has gotten, below 50 cents, and all the while, more and more, people are, making the commitment to solar. Back in 2003, when Revision Energy was started, I believe, solar panels were closer to $5 a watt. So again, technology improves, cheaper for the power, and all of a sudden more and more people are going solar. The adoption rate increases. What's necessary in order to pursue solar at the property? There's a few things here. Let's talk about them. 3 things, in fact. First of all, you want to have a relatively southward orientation to the building. A little bit east or west, one way or another, not such a big deal, but generally, we want to be sort of, facing south with a pitch. Again, building itself, the pitch of the roof, the angle of the roof, you want it to be somewhere between, 8, 12, 12, 12, between 30 and 40 degrees. And, that would be different, closer to the equator, for example, but, here in the Northern Hemisphere, to maximize, your exposure to the sun all the year long, you want an angle to your roof somewhere like that, something, akin to a 8, 12 or 10, 12, 12, 12, so on and so forth. So those are the first 2 factors. The last factor, in order to ensure a productive solar roof, if you will, would be shade. Shade can come from, buildings, trees, etc. There's a handy formula there, but frankly, this is something that most of us can sort of figure out on our own just by taking a quick glance. Is this a shady roof? Is this a sunny roof? So again, those are the 3 factors that impact solar productivity, solar siting here in Maine. And there's ways around all that. We can talk more about it as we go along. And it's worth noting that Maine and New Hampshire actually receive 33% more sunshine per year than Germany. There's more solar in Germany than anywhere else in the world. And so with that in mind, we do have a powerful solar resource here in New England. Many people are surprised to hear that, but it is certainly true. And even relative to other parts of this country, we do have quite a strong solar resource here in New England. In fact, if you were to sort of draw a latitudinal line heading east from Maine, you'd get the French Riviera, which in general is regarded as a pretty sunny place to be. So again, surprising to some, but we actually do have a very strong solar resource here in New England, and we can all take advantage of that. Now, there's a few different types of on-site solar, and this is a really important part of the discussion. And it's one that I try to have with all my clients as we sort of, begin the journey. Let's talk about on-site solar options. So the first would be off-grid, and that would require, a whole bunch of solar, a whole bunch of battery storage. And, again, in this case, there'd be no interaction whatsoever with the utility. So we're now talking about, a cabin on the side of the mountain, completely isolated. Now that's certainly possible. It's not work that Revision will do in general. And in fairness, here in New England, that's a pretty, it's a pretty drastic sort of lifestyle transition. You either need to spend just a huge amount of money on a very, very, very robust battery system, along with a huge solar array, or you'd need to, quite frankly, have a complement of some kind of fossil fuel, this or that, in order to keep you going throughout the winter. So, long story short, off-grid, it's achievable, maybe not practical for all of us. So again, that's not something that revision will do a whole lot of. More likely, we're going to do a grid-tied solar system with folks. And by and large, that means there's solar panels and the client is still connected to CMP in this case, or whatever the utility may be. Now in Maine, it's important to discuss the net metering policy at this juncture. That's what makes going solar so compelling for everyone here in Maine. And the net metering policy is basically a set of rules that governs the way in which a solar generating site can interact with the utility. What does it amount to in practice? It amounts to, in the summertime, a solar array will produce a whole lot more electricity than what the building itself is actually consuming at that time. All that surplus will in fact flow back through the meter, back through the wires to CMP, to the grid, and the account of the solar generator, that it will start to build up this big bank of credits that will offset the bill during times when the solar array is producing less than what the building needs. So all of a sudden that building's pulling power from the grid. And again, at those times, the credits that are built up by the solar are applied to sort of level out the bill. So this sort of give and take, there's no taxes involved, there's no fees involved. The point is that all the electricity a solar array produces will not lose its value if it goes back to the grid. It is applied at full value as kilowatt hour credits. And again, in practice, this basically means that most households with solar will overproduce in the summer, and that overproduction will apply to the winter bill to zero that out. Again, not every state has such a compelling net metering policy as we do here in Maine, and it makes it really easy for folks to go solar. And that's again the benefit of a grid-tied system. Now you might also pursue here in Maine a grid-tied system with battery backup, and for a couple of reasons it's important to note that the battery piece really just takes the place of a generator. We talked about the net metering policy, which is sort of a way for homeowners to use the grid itself as a battery, right? Because you send them your surplus solar, they hang on to it for you in your account and apply it to your bill as needed, right? So sort of in a theoretical way, that's a sort of a kind of storage. It's also important to note that with CMP, we don't have what's known as time of use rates. Our electricity from them is the same rate all the live long day. Now in California, for example, someone might have a battery without solar, and perhaps they would charge that battery at night when grid power is cheap, and then discharge the battery during the day when grid power is more expensive. And in that way, wiggle around the grid charges in order to have the battery save money. In Maine, electricity is the same price all day long, and in that way, again, no real way for the battery to save you money. So in this case, here in Maine, the battery basically just takes the place of a generator. Now we'll talk more about that and the ways in which a battery with solar compares quite favorably to a generator. This is obviously on a lot of people's minds. We just had a big old snowstorm, but again, important to note that that's the advantage of a battery, not so much a money-saving device. Long story short, as I said, 3 types of on-site solar, and grid-tied is certainly the most common. We'll talk a little bit about the ins and outs of rooftop solar installations. We can sort of read through here. Most systems cost between $20,000 and $25,000 for between 20 and 25 panels, and that system will pay for itself. And at this point, less than 10 years, that last CMP increase of rates, we saw payback periods really drop pretty much across the board below 10 years. With a 25-year warranty, that means you're going to pay yourself back on the solar investment 3 times before the warranties expire, which is very, very compelling indeed. We also have some loans we can set folks up with that are really a great way for people to effectively swap their CMP bill for a solar loan of about the same number of dollars per month. In that way, that means you can be cash flow neutral right off the bat. And once you get the tax credit, or once CMP's electric rates go up, all of a sudden your project is cash flow neutral. And with rates as low as 1.99%, it's just cheap money, and it's a really easy way for folks to go solar. Very compelling indeed. Now, leasing solar is not an option in Maine. It is in other states, not here. The federal tax credit, currently 26%. That's money that Uncle Sam will give you to go solar. That'll be included in your tax return so long as you have sufficient liability. Talk to your tax professional. We are solar professionals, not tax professionals. Need to make that message loud and clear. Now, in 2023, that credit will actually drop to 22%. What's going to happen afterwards? Anybody's guess. We will see. There is therefore some urgency to go solar as soon as you can. Again, no state incentive in Maine, with the exception of the net metering policy, which I would argue is an incentive in itself. We're looking for around 35 by 12 of roof space. What we want is a nice big square. Hip roofs can be a bit challenging. Roofs with a lot of obstructions can be a bit challenging. We're looking for a nice big square bit of roof space, although if that's not available, we can work around it. Standing seam, corrugated metal roofs, asphalt shingles, these can all easily accommodate solar, so long as the roof type has at least 10 years of life left to it. The last thing we want is to have to, take the solar down so that somebody can re-shingle, for example, only to put the solar back up a second time. So make sure you've got at least 10 years left of life to your roof before going solar. Right now we're seeing wattages for solar panels around 400 watts. That is a default, which is awesome. As I said, great warranty protection, 25 years. System's basically maintenance free. Set it and forget it, if you will. No reason to expect the system won't last 50 years or more. Over here on the right, we've got an example of a panel, of course, and then that's an inverter on the left. Important for me to note that solar panels produce DC electricity. Our homes, of course, run on AC current, so the inverter will just flip one to the other, and that inverter is Wi-Fi enabled. I should mention, we install SolarEdge inverters like that one as a default. Anytime you wish, you can take your phone, log on to the SolarEdge portal, and see exactly how much solar power you're producing. This is one of my very, very favorite pictures. This is actually the home of one of Jim I's colleagues, and boy, does that array just look slick. Sunset helps too. It's a nice, not just a nice photo in general, but yeah, really nice array here. A couple things to note up there on the upper portion, we've got what's known as mixed orientation, meaning panels in both landscape orientation and portrait. And then also important to note, as you can see a bit more clearly down here on the lower array, these are an all black panel, which is very, very appealing aesthetically. And that's what we're just installing as a default today. So, many people don't like the aesthetics of solar. I don't see why. I think that looks great. Almost like having a sheet of obsidian up there on your roof. But I'm slightly biased. So, I guess that's not a surprise. Let's talk a little bit about projects that go on the ground. If for some reason your roof isn't compelling, maybe it's got some trees around, as I said, maybe it's a triangular hipped roof, whatever the case may be, if for some reason your roof just won't produce the electricity you need, you could certainly consider a ground mounted solar array on your property. A little bit more expensive up front, there's some, increased work involved to get that project going. And, they do take up a fair amount of space, not as much as you see in the picture here. I'll explain more about this picture in a moment. But a ground-mounted array, that's really best suited for folks who have, what we call in Maine a back 40, a sort of big, flat bit of lawn, if you will, that's sort of not doing anything. Again, it can take up quite a bit of space. So sort of a somewhat specialized situation for, someone who might need a ground mount, but very common as well, even for a residential setting. So this is something we could pursue with you if you don't have, a viable roof. If you don't have a viable roof and you don't have a back 40, you might think, well, my property has no options for solar. You could certainly consider what's known as a community solar farm. Basically what happens there, revision, we find sites just like this one. We build massive ground mounted solar arrays, and members of the farm, they own effectively a portion of that power that's produced by the farm, a portion that's equivalent to whatever their usage is on an annual basis. And by virtue of the net metering policy we discussed, all of that power gets immediately put onto the grid, converted to kilowatt hour credits, and applied to the various members' accounts as needed. And again, the net metering policy makes it really, like in practice, so that it's no different if you have your panels up on your roof or at the farm. Again, your bill can be offset in the exact same fashion. Community solar farms are great for folks who live in condos or maybe in a particularly wooded area, whatever the case may be. This is a great option for anybody who wants to go solar and may just not be able to do it on their roof. As I said, the economics of this investment are just the same as if you had panels on the roof. I should mention you can finance a community solar farm, and you can also take advantage of the federal tax credit. So again, ground mount and community solar farm, other options for folks who may wish to go solar. Now let's talk more about the rest of the renewable energy transition. Again, it's not just about providing the electricity, it's about electrifying the home. And there's a few different ways to do that. The most common, and at this point, I'm sure everybody has seen heat pumps, right? I mean, friends, neighbors, at this point, it's very, very ubiquitous technology. And these appliances provide not only heating, but cooling as well. They do it in an extremely efficient way. And of course, they're electric, so they pair well with solar. So this is our colleague, Becca. I'm pretty sure that's the Harry Potter book series behind her right there. I can't say that for sure. I've never read them. But in any case, here we have up on the ceiling here an FS Mitsubishi wall-mounted indoor unit. At this point, I'm sure everybody's seen those. We've also got examples in the middle of a ceiling cassette. On the bottom, a floor-mounted indoor unit. Of course, these are all the indoor portions of the system. There's an outdoor condenser as well. That's what you're seeing off on the right. These systems use basically a refrigerant cycle, and they're able to, or that refrigerant itself is able to hold a tremendous amount of thermal energy within it. So unlike so many, heating systems that we're used to, you're not moving air from one place to another. You're moving thermal energy, and that's how these systems are able to be just so remarkably efficient. There's a great rebate potential through the state. You can get up to as much as $1,200 right now for making a heat pump investment. And again, heating and cooling in one, something that, every home's going to have the opportunity to pursue in some fashion, more in others, less in some. It's not a one size fits all technology. I should point that out. There is some nuance to it, but again, a really, at this point, very, very common approach to decarbonizing the household. Heat pumps for space heating and cooling. You can also use those, or heat pump technology, I should say, for your domestic hot water. Again, this is another electric solution. Many of us today in our homes in Maine, we still get our domestic hot water from, oil, right off the boiler or with a separate tank. And those are very, very expensive ways to get your domestic hot water. The heat pump water heater, conversely, maybe some of you have these at this point. Maybe not. It's similar to an electric tank in a way, but there's actually a condenser. So I'll back up a sec. In this case, we've got these outdoor condensers utilizing the outdoor air. In the case of a heat pump water heater, that condenser is right at the top of the tank. So you're in fact using the air typically within the basement is where these tanks are located. You're using the heat within that air to heat the domestic hot water. Again, that showers, sinks, dishwashers, etc. And this is the cheapest way to get your domestic hot water over the course of the year. The numbers bear that out. It's exceptionally cheap to get your hot water in this fashion. And because there's a condenser, you're also dehumidifying the basement while you produce your hot water. There's also one other byproduct, a little bit of condensation. Not a big deal to deal with that. Again, the important thing to note here is that most New England basements, to some extent or another, will benefit from dehumidification. And in this way, you're able to do that whilst providing your domestic hot water in the cheapest way possible. I have to say that of all the things I recommend when I'm out meeting with folks, I probably recommend this solution the most. It really is low-hanging fruit as far as home improvement investments go. What I mean by that is it's a modest investment relative to some others, and it's going to pay for itself just so quickly, well under 10 years while being under warranty for 10 years. Just an easy, quick win for all of us. Anybody who doesn't have one of these should consider it. And Janet Mills agrees. There's an $850 state rebate for this investment as well. So yeah, low-hanging fruit, heat pump water heaters. I'm a big believer in their value. As I said, we'll talk a little bit more about battery backup, and it's a subject that's on everybody's mind around this time of year when we're getting power outages as related to snowstorms. Folks want a way to keep their home going when these outages occur. Maine's the most heavily forested state in the contiguous United States. And all of our power, unlike other parts of the country, all our power is overhead. It's not underground in general. It's overhead. That means that trees are falling. We're losing power a lot. CMP doesn't exactly go out of its way to keep its infrastructure resilient. What they do is they willingly let their infrastructure atrophy, pass the cost of repair onto the ratepayer. And so we all need to be mindful of how often we'll be losing power. And at this point, many of us are considering, replacing our generators with batteries that are powered by solar. Here's a familiar face, good old Bill, standing next to the Tesla Powerwall. I should point out that this is somewhere in another part of the country. In Maine, you couldn't have your Tesla Powerwall outdoors. But in any case, this is, the battery backup solution that we're installing, by far the most of. We've been doing so for a number of years. And it's a really clean, elegant solution that we're super happy with, and our clients are as well. And the Tesla Powerwall has about 13.5 kilowatt hours of usable storage for folks to use during an outage. And that means that, and I should point out that that's, well less than what you'd see in an electric vehicle as far as battery size. A little bit more, we can talk about that in just a second, but that 13.5 kilowatt hours that you can use, the most common approach is for folks to identify a series of critical loads within the home. That might be, the fridge, lights and outlets, maybe hot water, maybe some hydronic heating, these sort of things, and power those with one Tesla Powerwall. Typically, you can get about 24 hours of backup for those loads without solar recharge. But of course, during a grid outage, the solar panels will in fact charge the battery. So you can, if you're using your loads thoughtfully, you can basically plan on a sort of endless backup scheme. Of course, if you add more batteries, you can back up more, you can get a lengthier sort of, outage plan going. But that might not be for everyone. Just a little comparison here between generators and batteries. I think the big one is just the noise. Tesla Powerwalls, battery solutions, they're quiet. Generators are noisy. You don't have to refuel, a battery in the same way you have to refuel a generator. What if there's an outage, a lengthy one, and the fuel truck can't get down the road? The battery is being recharged by sunshine. There's no, annual maintenance required for a battery. There's no weekly self-test. And of course, there's no, fossil fuel involved. So, I would argue that a battery investment, which of course gets that same 26% federal tax credit, I would argue that that's the more sustainable solution and just a preferable solution going forward. Again, though, I'm of course highly biased. But if someone on the sort of consultation today is considering generators, I'd urge you to give us a call, and we can talk about what your alternative options might be with battery backup. Again, it's something that many folks are considering today at the same time as considering their solar investment, and with good reason. Let's see here. One last thing you might be considering in order to electrify your home is an electric vehicle. And of course, that vehicle may need to be charged at home. These are the chargers that we install most often, the Clipper Creek there on the left, the Tesla charger on the right. The average American drives 12,000 miles a year. The average electric vehicle is getting about 4 miles per kilowatt hour. So that works out to about 3,000 kilowatt hours needed per year in order to charge the average American's electric vehicle. That works out to about 9 solar panels or so on the average roof. So it is totally possible for you to, get an electric vehicle and charge it at home entirely with a solar array that's, that's providing you an electric rate that's well less than what CMP can offer. So, the economics of making that switch are very, very compelling indeed. And it's worth me mentioning too, as I said a moment ago, the batteries within electric vehicles are far larger than the ones we just talked about in size. I believe the F-150 Ford Lightning truck, that we're expecting that battery to be somewhere in the 150 kilowatt hour range. So it's interesting to note that many folks may also consider, this electric vehicle, and let's face it, we're all going to have electric vehicles fairly soon. And many folks are going to consider that as a sort of 2 birds with 1 seed situation, right? They can, drive that vehicle around as needed, but when there's an outage, they can sort of flip the switch, and all of a sudden that battery within the electric vehicle is powering the home, sort of with a bi-directional charger, some sort of transfer switch. The technology, it's here. We're sort of waiting to see how the ins and outs play out. But long story short, many of us may consider getting an electric vehicle and having that be a generator replacement, maybe as opposed to or in conjunction with a standalone battery in the basement or garage. So a lot of nuance there, but again, I think the important thing to note is that most of us will be getting an electric vehicle very soon, and it's totally possible to charge it at home with your own solar and perhaps use that as your generator replacement. And again, sort of, just to summarize, the whole idea here is to electrify the home as much as you can, and to as great an extent as possible, of course. And in so doing, right, we're going to save money, and we're going to be doing, something that's in all of our best interests when you think about offsetting the worst effects of climate change. We need to be pursuing a carbon-free energy future as a whole, as a society. What does that mean? It means a few different things. Of course, we've talked about all this, but to summarize, it means pursuing renewable sources like solar, updating our electric grid, making it more modern, making it more resilient, and then of course pursuing storage as well. We talked a little bit about battery storage at the home, battery storage at grid level, at grid scale, that's part of the equation as well. Why? It's because renewable sources, they're variable. You can't always count on it being sunny or windy for that matter. Renewable sources are unpredictable in that way. So it's important to, be storing as much of that as possible to provide, power for municipalities, so on and so forth, at times when renewable sources are less favorable. And it's something, a great example of the importance of this, we can all call to mind what happened in Texas. There's this sort of weird narrative going around that it had something to do with their over-reliance on renewables. That's simply not the case. The thermal power plants in Texas, their output was down 25%. Renewables at that time was only down 1%. And meanwhile, there was no storage whatsoever to speak of. And so, of course, this part of the country that wasn't prepared for the weather it saw was not prepared for what was going to happen to its sort of larger grid and infrastructure. And that's why we saw what happened happen. And my hope is that, that part of the country is now doubling down on renewables and ways to store that renewable energy in order to be better prepared in the future for those sorts of situations. Again, these are not just solutions that we need to pursue an individual household, scale. We need to pursue it at grid scale as well. And the idea of, producing huge amounts of electricity with renewables, electrifying our buildings, and then storing that electricity as well. Improving the grid, creating microgrids. There's a lot of work to do, but it's work that we can all do. All of us can pursue solar at home. All of us can pursue the electrified household. And I hope I've made it clear how we can do that together. And one last thing I'll say is that in Maine, I think there's a certain type of person who just likes the idea of being independent, sort of owning their energy, not being over-reliant on, let's face it, CMP. We're a bunch of mavericks. We're independent. We're, sort of very, fiercely independent, I would say. And I think that these sort of solutions appeals to that part of us, that adventurous spirit in all of us Mainers. The dollars and cents sort of speak for themselves. Of course, we've got another sort of visual here illustrating how, exactly how much you can save by pursuing this, renewable energy transition. And I hope that many of you on the call today will give us another call and talk to us about, what your options are. You might meet with me, one of my colleagues, one of my fellow designers. Again, we're anxious to sort of talk about your options and help you figure out ways that you can save money in the same fashion and also reduce your carbon footprint. And we have done this many, 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 many thousands of times throughout New England. So you're in good hands with Revision Energy. And, like I said, please do give us a call. We're anxious to get on your schedule, come pay you a visit. With masks on, and see what your options are to go solar, to pursue the renewable energy transition. You might find that this is a great way to increase your home value while you're at it. I like to include this. The last folks I gave this presentation to were real estate agents, and they were sort of keen to know from a sort of unbiased source exactly what this will do for the bottom line. And this is an article from Zillow, which indicates that you'll be increasing your home value by about 15,000 or more by pursuing the renewable energy transition. Anyway, that's the dollars and cents part. Obviously, there's far more to it than that. So we are going to, at this point, switch over to Q&A, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions, and I'm sure Jill will be keen to join in as well. But thanks for everyone's attention so far, and there's our information right there, my information as well, so you can feel free to reach out off the record if you like.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, if anyone has questions, drop them into the chat now, but we already have a few, which is awesome. So we'll just tackle them. So Chris, how do most residential array owners handle their RECs? You want to talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, happily. So what Jill's mentioning there is renewable energy certificates. And, you know, in fairness, I sort of think of these as carbon credits, quite frankly. You know, for every 1,000 kilowatt hours or for every 1 megawatt hour that a residential array produces, you know, a renewable energy certificate will be produced. And those actually have value. There's a market for these, and it's a little bit nuanced to explain what that means. You know, every state has a different renewable energy portfolio standard, and therefore every state requires utilities, for example, to purchase a certain number of these RECs in order to satisfy that standard, or perhaps they require these utilities to, you know, make a certain amount of their own renewable energy to satisfy that standard. In any case, long story short, you can produce these RECs at home and they have value. And typically what our clients do is they work with Knollwood Energy. That's a third-party aggregator of these credits that we work with. And long story short, they can send folks a check once a quarter for the value of their RECs. It ends up being $300 to $500 a year for most folks, depending on the size of their solar array. And again, as I said, this is fairly nuanced. A lot of people choose to retire their RECs, and I think there's a good philosophical reason to do so. But to be quite clear with you, you know, the vast majority of our clients do, in fact, work with Knollwood, and they sell their RECs for a few $100 a year. And why not? It's another way to drive down the payback period for your solar investment. Again, a fair amount of nuance here, and I'd encourage you to reach out to me separately if you want a deeper discussion, but that's sort of the nuts and bolts of it.
Awesome. I just want to quickly address, someone just asked, does New Hampshire have net metering? And yes, with the exception of community solar, everything that Chris talked about is relevant for Maine as well as, or New Hampshire as well as Maine. So yeah, so then the next question we got was, does Revision provide O&M services to residential owners?
We certainly have a service team, and that's, you know, one thing that really does set us apart from many of our I don't want to use competitors. This isn't like a fight or anything, but, you know, that's certainly something that sets us apart from many other solar contractors here in Maine, is we do have our own dedicated service team, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. If there's ever an issue, you know, we can certainly get there and sort it out as quickly as possible. And we do have, you know, we're in the midst of sort of putting together some O&M packages that people can pursue. That's not necessarily a default at the moment, but that's something that we are in the process of putting together options of these service packages for folks. You know, the truth of the matter is that in general, for a residential solar system, at least, that's just really not something you're going to have to worry about. It really is a set it and forget it technology. We're talking about, an aluminum frame, tempered glass on top of the cells, very, very robust. And it, oftentimes if there is an issue with the solar system, it's one that we can sort out remotely, a trouble with the inverter, this sort of thing. So in general, I just wouldn't expect a whole lot of service necessary for your solar system over the course of its lifetime. A little bit different story with heat pumps, of course. Those we do recommend getting an annual service between once a year, once every 2 years. But as long as homeowners are doing, the tiny little bit of maintenance that they need to do for those systems on their own, then again, that's really a pretty marginal time and money investment for that service. But long story short, to answer that question, yes, we are sort of at this point developing some different O&M packages that folks can pursue. That'll be conducted by our service team. And I'll quickly say with regard to that previous question, I'm certainly not an expert on net metering in New Hampshire. I strictly work here in Maine, but I do believe there's different of course, there's a few different utilities there and they approach net metering differently. If I'm not mistaken, the most common situation is that you get a dollar credit for your exported solar, capped out at $600. That was my last. Does that sound right to you, Jill, with the co-op?
I'm not sure.
Anyway, if you want to learn more about how that's done in New
Yeah.
Hampshire, reach out to us. We'll connect with some of our colleagues, but I can say pretty confidently that it's not quite as compelling as it is here in Maine.
So I just want to go back quickly to the heat pumps, Chris. Someone on Facebook asked about how you can do heat pumps with existing ductwork and not have the mini splits in the individual rooms. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, so in general, I can say that revision has shied away from ducted heat pump solutions. The truth of the matter is that, these systems, they're able to, we talked about the fact that we're not moving air from place to place. When you move air through a duct, no matter how well that duct is insulated, you're going to lose conditioning in the journey from A to B. And so for that reason, we pretty strictly adhere to doing non-ducted heat pump systems only. And, if you wanted to reach out to me separately, I can connect you with some other folks that might be interested in working with you on utilizing the existing ducted system. I think there'd be some risks there. For one thing, if there's existing ductwork in the building, that means it was sized, hopefully, to, a boiler or a furnace. And, that ductwork sizing may not strictly apply to a heat pump system. It may not be the right size at all. And moreover, I think you'll find that if you're moving, cool air through a ductwork at certain times of year and hot air through a ductwork at other times, you're going to create the risk for mold, among other things, condensation, mold. So I think that would be a project to really do some due diligence on before committing to. Again, we try to stick to the sort of meat and potatoes of heat pumps, if you like, projects that we are certain are going to deliver, good environmental and economic benefit. And that, in our experience, is just the non-ducted heat pump system. Sorry to sort of squash your enthusiasm, whoever just asked that question. I hope I didn't. Again, I'd be happy to connect you with some folks who might be able to work with you on that specific project.
Yeah, and then a follow-up question, similar, just still on heat pumps. I've read that certain homeowner insurance companies won't offer coverage for homes that use heat pumps exclusively for heat without another backup system in cold climate areas. Is that true?
Yeah, I've encountered that as well. Pretty edge case situation. I have encountered folks who, are in older homes and have been told by their home insurance provider, we will not underwrite this home if you, switch to heat pumps and don't have some other source in the building. That's happened very, very few times. And I think in general, if we're talking about a new construction home, high performance home, in those situations, you're able to, verify, excellent insulation in the walls and the attic and the basement, triple pane windows. If you can take a lot of these steps to really button up the home quite tightly, again, in the case of new construction or recent construction, if you could do that, it is possible with ease to condition, an entire building with heat pumps alone. But for many of us, who are, in an older home, I mean, this is, this is Maine and New England, after all. A lot of us are living in homes from the 1800s or earlier. So in those cases, it's typically not advisable to, rip out the furnace or rip out the electric baseboard or whatever the case may be. Our objective in that situation will be to provide as much of the annual heat load as we can with this more efficient technology, keeping in the back of our minds, however, that there will be certain times when, you'll probably need that backup solution just to give the heat pumps a shot in the arm. So that's the most common approach, I would say, is, and I'll take that a step further. The most common design that we'll go for will be, one large mini split heat pump system on the first floor, the main living space, kitchen, living room, dining room, a second zone in the second zone in the primary bedroom, we like to start there and really only add additional zones as warranted, and often it's not warranted. Anyway, to address the question once more, I have encountered that, not very often, however.
Awesome. Susan, if you are still listening, Susan asked that question. She has revision solar panels on her house. So we will reach out directly, Susan, and get you specifics on your house. Cool. Okay, so another question that came in is about monitoring. Is there a way to track your array's production? Is there a way to track your array's production?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked a little bit about the inverter. Again, solar panels produce DC electricity. Our homes run on AC current. So the intermediary between, your panels and your electric panel is the inverter, and that inverter almost certainly going to be a SolarEdge inverter. That's the industry leader. That's what we install as a default. That inverter does the conversion from DC to AC, but it's also a Wi-Fi enabled appliance. And therefore, anytime you wish, you can pull out the SolarEdge monitoring portal on your smartphone and check and see how much power did I produce today, this week, this month, etc. It's also worth me noting that you can get some good consumption data from that equipment, meaning that you can actually figure out what your home's consuming. That's a good way to track your energy usage relative to your solar production, which is a good ambition. Lastly, I will say, we talked about RECs a bit earlier in the Q&A period. You can actually, again, because the SolarEdge inverter is Wi-Fi enabled, that's how you'll be able to capture that dollar value for your RECs, because the inverters are revenue grade monitoring capable as well. So a lot of options for monitoring, again, via the SolarEdge inverter.
Awesome. Okay, so we have one more question, which is Maine specific. So before we tackle that, I just wanted to quickly plug the battery storage webinar that we're doing next week. It's on Wednesday. Kim, who's actually based in our Enfield, New Hampshire office, she will be running that, all about solar and backup storage. So the link is in the chat if anyone wants to sign up for that. So that will be, and that's battery storage for Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. So the final question is Maine specific, and it's, can you explain, contrast more the single home installation you're talking about versus the model that's popping up everywhere, community solar, the mailers that everyone is getting in the mail?
That is a great question. I'm happy to explain the difference. So what you're referring to, what you're receiving mailers, I presume that you're receiving them from Nexamp. Jill, what are some other ones that you've seen besides Nexamp? I know
Power Market.
Yeah, I've gotten a few. It's kind of hard to keep track. In any case, what they're offering is subscription solar. Now, let me qualify this a little bit before I go on. First of all, there's no such thing as bad solar, and what these companies are offering is ultimately a good thing. And I should also say that Revision will do a subscription solar plan with you as well. So if this sounds like the option for you, let us know and we can connect you with the right folks at Revision. But in any case, subscription solar, it's sort of like the equivalent of selecting, one apartment or another, depending on the cost. There's no investment involved. Basically, what you're saying to CMP is, instead of taking your standard offer supply, that's what all of us have by and large for our electric supply, not the delivery portion of our bill, not the cost of getting the electricity to us, the cost for the power itself. Most of us have CMP's standard offer. Right now, it's around 7 cents per kilowatt hour. It's what makes up that total rate of 21 cents. Now, again, what you're choosing with subscription solar is you're going to tell CMP, I don't want your standard offer anymore. I want to get my supply from Nexamp or from Power Market, whatever the case may be. These companies are guaranteeing a certain savings over the CMP's supply, and they're also guaranteeing that this will be a completely solar supply. So you're basically, again, just electing to get your electricity elsewhere, still delivered by CMP. You'll still be a customer of theirs, but you're electing to get it from an alternate supply, solar powered, and they guarantee a certain savings. I know Nexamp guarantees 15%. I think Revision's option is about 10%. Again, what they're guaranteeing is a savings. So you're not making an investment. You're not outlaying any cash up front. And in that way, as I said, it's sort of the equivalent of like selecting one apartment versus another based on its price, based on how much money you'll save. You're not building equity. Now, community solar ownership based, that's what I talked about a little earlier. In that case, you're making an investment. You're buying your share of this farm. And in that way, you can take the federal tax credit, you can get an ROI year over year. Of course, you can see an increased savings and a return on your investment based on this cash outlay that you make, whether it's financed or a cash purchase. So that's sort of like, having a condo in effect, because, you're buying something, but what you're buying is not on your property, but you still can build equity. Roof mounted solar, we would equate to, buying a home where, you're building equity, it's on your property, blah, blah, blah. So again, I'd like to make it clear that, what they're offering is a good thing for many folks who just simply can't make any kind of investment at the moment. That's a great way to begin the renewable energy transition. Commit to solar, save some bucks, reduce your carbon footprint. But, I think at the same time, many of us might just consider that to be a step one, and they may in time choose an investment opportunity. But long story short, I'm a fan of a good summary, and subscription solar, it's a good thing, but it's mostly just an alternative to CMP's supply that will save you a little bit of cash. Hopefully that makes it clear.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Chris. It is 12:58. So we're gonna wrap up, but thank you everyone for joining. We did record this, and I'll send it out to everyone who registered so that you can watch it back if you want, or forward it to friends who weren't able to join. And I put a few links in the chat for our various signups. I also put in more info about the solar farms. And yeah, battery webinar will be next Wednesday. So yeah, thanks everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks for joining, everybody. Take care.